हेलो एवरीवन, जय हिंद एंड वेलकम टू द प्लेटफॉर्म ऑफ श्रीराम आईएएस। आप सभी का स्वागत है श्रीराम आईएएस के प्लेटफॉर्म पर। और आज हम यहां पर डिस्कस करने वाले अबाउट COP30, वेदर इट वाज अ सक्सेस और फेलियर। नाउ व्हाई हैव चूजन दिस टॉपिक, इसके बारे में भी मैं बात करता हूं बिकॉज व्हेन इट कम्स टू यूपीएससी, जब हम यूपीएससी की बात करते हैं तो यूपीएससी जनरली आस्क यू द क्वेश्चंस ऑन बोथ दी पर्सपेक्टिव्स, है ना। वहां पर अगर हम देखें तो दोनों पर्सपेक्टिव पे और एक बैलेंस्ड ओवरव्यू जो है वो हमें देना होता है। एंड अल्टीमेटली नाउ यू नो दैट द यूपीएससी इंटरव्यूज विल स्टार्ट। सो इफ यू हैव क्लियर द यूपीएससी मेंस 2025 देन अगेन दिस टॉपिक इज अ करंट टॉपिक एंड आपके लिए काफी इंपॉर्टेंट हो जाता है इंटरव्यू के लिए एंड फॉर द मेंस पर्सपेक्टिव एज वेल if you are sitting in UPSC 2026। तो अल्टीमेटली ये आपके लिए मेंस पर्सपेक्टिव के लिए भी इंपॉर्टेंट है और प्रीलिम्स के लिए तो इंपॉर्टेंट है ही। सो अल्टीमेटली यहां पर हम बात करेंगे आपका कि वेदर इट वाज अ फेलियर और अ सक्सेस एंड यहां पर एक बैलेंस्ड ओवरव्यू देखेंगे। बट बिफोर दैट Why COP30 मैटर्स, क्यों ये आपका मैटर करता है और साथ ही साथ इसके बारे में हम समझते हैं बिकॉज व्हेन इट कम्स टू द पेरिस एग्रीमेंट, ठीक है, पेरिस एग्रीमेंट की बात करें सो अल्टीमेटली देयर इज कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑफ पार्टीज जो कि आपका यूनाइटेड नेशन फ्रेमवर्क कन्वेंशन ऑन क्लाइमेट चेंज यानी कि UNFCCC के अंतर्गत आपका वी हैव द कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑफ पार्टीज जो कि एवरी एनुअल गैदरिंग होती है आपका एंड देयर दे डिसाइड लॉट्स ऑफ थिंग्स। ठीक है, आपका जो टारगेट्स है वो आपका अचीव हुए नहीं हुए, साथ ही साथ आपका एनुअल टारगेट्स क्या होंगे एंड प्लस जो नेक्स्ट 1 ईयर में व्हाट ऑल थिंग्स नीड टू बी डन। सो अल्टीमेटली अगर मैं बात करूं यहां पर सो दिस इज वेयर द इंप्लीमेंटेशन कम्स, alright, and that is why where we have all the different stakeholders जो कि आपका गैदर होते हैं यहां पर and they discuss। so this is a critical moment जहां पर जो pledges हैं वो देखा जाता है कि whether they have translated into the actions or not। इसी के साथ साथ दिस वॉज द फर्स्ट कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑफ पार्टी जो कि आपका रेन फॉरेस्ट में ऑर्गेनाइज की गई। दिस वॉज इन बीलम और बीलम में आपका ब्राजील में आपका ये कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑफ पार्टी जो है ऑर्गेनाइज की गई थी द COP30 एंड अल्टीमेटली here the focus was on the forest and the justice as well as climate justice, and this is where we have the rising disaster and geopolitical tension that demands a solution। so ultimately this has a very important timing as well। ठीक है, जहां पर यूएस जो है वो अपने आप को जो है UNFCCC के फ्रेमवर्क से पेरिस एग्रीमेंट से अपने आप को अलग करता है। वी ऑल्सो सी द साउथ टू साउथ कॉपरेशन दैट वाज मेजरली फोकस्ड इन COP30। सो अल्टीमेटली ओवर हियर द टाइमिंग इज ऑल्सो क्रूशियल एंड अर्जेंट एज वेल। Now there were certain expectations जो कि आपका COP30 से expected था and there were certain things that were delivered। So what was expected? The first thing is that it was expected कि fossil fuel फेज आउट रोड मैप जो है वो यहां पर तैयार किया जाएगा। ठीक है, देयर वर मोर देन 80 कंट्रीज जो कि आपका दे फॉर्म्ड अ कोलिशन और वो जो मोर देन 80 कंट्रीज थी दे वांटेड कि एक कंप्लीट रोड मैप जो है वो आपका प्रिपेयर किया जाए वेयर द फॉसिल फ्यूल फेज आउट रोड मैप शुड बी देयर। ठीक है, इसी के साथ साथ व्हेन इट कम्स टू द फॉरेस्ट राइट्स एंड द इंडिजीनियस राइट्स, इनके बारे में भी इट वाज एक्सपेक्टेड कि आपका कुछ ना कुछ कमिटमेंट्स जो है वो आपका लेट डाउन किए जाए बिकॉज दिस इज द फर्स्ट टाइम दैट अ COP हैड बीन ऑर्गेनाइज्ड इन द रेन फॉरेस्ट रीजन। इसी के साथ साथ इट वाज एक्सपेक्टेड कि जो क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस है उसमें क्लैरिटी के साथ साथ उसको स्केल अप किया जाए एंड देन इट वाज आल्सो एक्सपेक्टेड कि देयर शुड बी अ बाइंडिंग मिटिगेशन टारगेट्स जो कि लेट डाउन किए जाएं। बट एट द सेम टाइम व्हाट वाज डिलीवर्ड, so over here what was delivered was that adaptation finance has to be tripled by 2035। इसी के साथ साथ voluntary frameworks जो है वो यहां पर डिसाइड किए गए। there are no mandatory कट ऑफ्स या नो मैंडेटरी फेज आउट प्लान जो कि यहां पर आपका तैयार किया गया एंड अल्टीमेटली द मल्टीलेटरल प्रोसेस हैज बीन मेंटेन्ड जहां पर थ्रू कंसेंसस जो आपका म्यूटराव डिक्लेरेशन है या फिर हम कहें जो बीलम पैकेज है वो आपका विद कंसेंसस इट हैज बीन पास्ड एंड अल्टीमेटली व्हेन इट कम्स टू वेदर इट वाज अ सक्सेस सो इट वाज जस्ट अ पार्शियल सक्सेस but at the same time there are major gaps जो कि यहां पर आपका देखने को मिले। So ultimately this is all that I'll be covering in today's session and it is again I'm reiterating that it is important for your prelims, it is important for your mains as well as if you will be sitting for the interview as well। So this topic or this complete session is very crucial for your UPSC preparation। Now what are the key outcomes? जब हम key outcomes की बात करते हैं तो I told you that this was a partial success and the partial failure as well। All right, when it comes to the partial success, जो adaptation finance है, it got boosted, and this is a major development for the developing nations and ultimately the multilateral framework that has survived despite that there had been deep divisions और आपका बहुत सारे divisions जो है वो आपको देखने को मिले, but at the same time the consensus was reached. At the same time, it is a partial failure because I told you the fossil fuel commitments, they weakened significantly and ultimately finance clarity जो है वो यहाँ पर नहीं है, and there is enforcement mechanism also that is missing from COP30 as well. And there is, there is trust deficit that has deepened between the global north and the south. After the major officials of the USA, they did not participated in COP30, and जो credibility है of COP process, ये आपका that had been questioned worldwide. So I'll be covering the outcomes of this COP30. What were the failures and what are the successes? What are the major wins in today's session completely throughout? So please stay with me till the end of this session as well. All right, now what did we did right? All right, or what the where we can say that there were major wins in the COP30. Now, when it comes to COP30, what went right? The first thing is the first win is the adaptation finance boost, where it had been decided that the finance will increase to 3 times or 3-folds. The adaptation funding will triple by 2035. At the same time, the target had been scaled. The major political win for the major developing nations is that the target had been laid down for $1 trillion, exactly 1.3 trillion. All right, 1.3 trillion US dollars. This is the target that had been raised for the adaptation financing. All right, this adaptation finance, it will support the resilience infrastructure as well as the climate smart agriculture and coastal protection system as well in the developing nations. All right, at the same time, the developing countries, they will secure long sought financial commitments through the COP or UNFCCC framework, and that is again our first boost or first win when it comes to the adaptation finance boost. The second win was the global Mentorship framework. Now, when it comes to the Mentorship framework over here, the major focuses were on the mitigation, where emission reduction strategies had been laid down. At the same time, adaptation, where resilience building had been focused, and the finance as well, जहाँ पर resource mobilization की बात की गई, and this resource mobilization, it should come not just from the government but also from the private players, and there should be a proper private sector financing as well. That was discussed in Mentorship framework, and ultimately the major goal is to protect the nature and also to provide the social justice to the indigenous people and the people in general. So ultimately, when it comes to global Mentorship framework, so this integrates trade dialogues and the indigenous participation as well. And also, it broadens the climate governance that is beyond the emission reduction or the emission alone. So ultimately, this is the second win when it comes to the COP30 that happened in Belém in Brazil. The next win is the inclusion of the indigenous people and the leadership that was provided. So ultimately, when it comes to the indigenous or the tribes that were, that were accepted at the COP30. So when it comes to those tribes, the indigenous people, there was a record participation, and it saw that there was unprecedented indigenous representation at the negotiating tables that was seen at COP30. As well as the land and community rights were acknowledged, though they do not they are not binding. At the same time, Amazon context amplified the visibility of the forest guardians, or there had been a global awareness about the participation of the indigenous people in conservation as well as the protection of the nature. So ultimately, this is the third win, that is inclusion as well as the indigenous leadership that we have seen. At the same time, the fourth win is that the diplomacy endured the process. All right, this is a multilateral process, and ultimately this multilateral process survived, where there were profound geopolitical division between various countries. But however, the COP30 produced a consensus text. The text was signed by consensus, and although there were major divisions between various nations and the various parties which participated in COP30, but at the same time, this diplomacy have survived through the COP30 as well. And this shows that there is a global cooperation mechanism and that is still functioning under the pressure. It maintains a forward momentum towards the COP31 as well, and the UNFCCC framework, it remains intact after the negotiations as well. So ultimately, this is the fourth win that the multilateral process have survived throughout. So these are the 4 wins that we can see, or the success of the COP30, that is adaptation finance got boost, then the global Mutrao framework, then the inclusion of and the participation and the leadership of the indigenous people that was recognized, and ultimately the multilateral process that have survived through COP30. But at the same time, there were certain failures as well. Or you can say that it failed at some point of time. Where did the COP30 have failed? So the first failure was that there is no fossil fuel phase-out plan that had been rolled out. This was missing from the context or the text of the final Belem package, and ultimately the final agreement contained zero mention of the fossil fuels. However, when we are talking about the countries, so there were more than 80 countries, they formed a coalition and demanded that a complete roadmap for phasing out of the fossil fuel should be, it should be prepared. And ultimately, that demand of more than 80 countries was overruled. All right, now over here, these countries who have formed the coalition, they have voluntarily they have said that they will phase out, they will develop a roadmap. This is optional phase out roadmap that was created outside the framework of the United Nations Framework Convention on the climate change. So when we are talking about the climate change, yes, it demands right action and immediate action. At the same time, the COP30 have delivered silence when it comes to the rollout or the phase out of the fossil fuels. The second failure is that there is a weak and delayed finance. When it comes to the finance or the finance mechanism that had been adopted, the target is 2035. Alright, the target for increasing the finance had been taken to be 2035, and it is too late because we need the finance, especially the developing countries need that adaptation finance. It is on the urgent basis. Alright, we are already seeing that there are a lot of extreme climate events that are happening. Alright, so ultimately this the target, it is too late. At the same time, there is no clarity on contributor obligations as well as the amounts that will be paid by the various contributors, and there is vague language that is without specific financial commitments that was included in the finance commitments, and at the same time it is non-binding. The provisions are non-binding without or with no accountability mechanisms that had been laid down. So yes, the win is that the adaptation finance will triple by 2035, but at the same time there are no obligations, there are no binding targets, there is no clarity who pays and how much they will pay. So there is another failure that we are talking about. The third failure is that the deforestation roadmap had been dropped. I told you that this COP30 was the first time that the COP or Conference of Parties was held in a rainforest regime. Over here, it was, when the COP started or it was just about to begin, there were talks about, safeguarding the tropical rainforest or the tropical forest because they are important for the complete ecosystem. But at the same time, there was dropping off the deforestation roadmap, and although it was held in Amazon, yet no deforestation end roadmap was developed or declared at the end of the COP30, and the biodiversity and nature protection was diluted in the final text as well. At the same time, this is seen as concession to Brazil and other forest nations because their, the forests, they are being converted into agricultural land and for the development perspective very rapidly. And when it comes to the Amazon, more than 30% of the Amazon rainforest had already been cleared for the different projects that is being, they are under development in Brazil itself. So ultimately इसकी वजह से the indigenous communities, they were disappointed by the weak commitments that were taken for the deforestation roadmap, which was completely dropped from the final text. Ultimately, the next failure that we can talk about is the trust deficit that has widened or it has deepened after COP30. Now, when it comes to the emission must, they may peak or they must peak now. That is what the science is saying. But at the same time, when it comes to the COP30, we have adopted weak mitigation language when it comes to phasing out of the fossil fuels. All right, and ultimately there would be too little, too late for the global, mitigation. Mitigation. For the mitigation, it will be too late for acting on phasing out on the fossil fuels. And the credibility of the Conference of Parties, it is now upon, or there is a big question mark that has been raised. Now, when it comes to the trust deficit, of course, when there were more than 80 countries, so ultimately the phase out plan should have been there. Now they are forming another coalition and they would be working outside the United Nations Framework Convention on the Climate Change. So ultimately the trust that was there on UNFCCC, that was weakened by the COP30. Alright, the next failure is that the justice and equity had been ignored. When it comes to equity, alright, so when it comes to the equity, that was what India wanted in the COP30. That is that the developed nations, they must pay more. Alright, because they have reaped the benefits of using the fossil fuels before the developing countries. So ultimately the equity questions were ignored and the justice was also ignored. The strong discussions were about the climate vulnerable nations and they advocated the forcefully about the various mitigation technologies or the various mitigation strategies that should be adopted and even the finance mechanism. But at the same time, that was not delivered properly. Even the loss and damage featured prominently in debates by these nations and equity principles were widely invoked by the developing nations. At the same time, there were weak outcomes and ultimately the big polluters, they resisted the binding obligation. And the classic example is USA. Alright, the classic example is USA, which has or it will take itself out from the Paris Agreement. Because now US, the president of USA, he has said कि जो fossil fuels हैं उनको use करना ज़रूरी है. And everything that is happening about the fossil fuels or the phasing out of the fossil fuels, that is not necessary because ultimately that is how the earth will survive. So I don't know about US president, but at the same time he said that his country will follow the rapid industrialization. They will keep on using the fossil fuel and they will not cut on the fossil fuel, and that is why he said that no official, high official will visit the COP30 and US have kept itself out from the COP30. So ultimately, the big polluters they have resisted the obligations that were there and they have said that they should not be binding, and the vulnerable countries saw the result inadequate. Alright. Ultimately, the justice is rhetoric. It did not translate it into action, and that is another failure, that justice and equity had been ignored. Now, what had been India's position? Let's talk about India's position as well. That is पूरे उसमें हमारी क्या position रही है? Because ultimately, when you will be writing questions or you will be answering the question in front of the board, so you must keep the position of India also in mind. Now, when it comes to the diplomatic stance of India, so we have championed the adaptation finance for the developing nation, and that shows the global South solidarity. And India has championed itself when it comes to the cooperation between South and South. At the same time, we have avoided any binding fossil fuel commitments. This aligns with the development needs of India itself. Alright, so ultimately when it comes to non-binding the fossil fuel commitments, so that shows energy pragmatism of India as well. At the same time, we navigated the climate justice imperatives with development requirement, and that shows a strategic balance that India has shown during the COP30. Now, what could be the implications for India? There are certain opportunities as well as challenges that could be faced by India. Now, when it comes to the increased adaptation finance flow, so that will flow toward the heat action plans for the urban centers, the coastline resilience infrastructure that is required, keeping in mind the severity of the cyclones that is increasing, as well as climate smart agriculture system that we require, and also the water security projects. So these are the opportunities where we can use the adaptation finance, and ultimately we can develop heat action plans, we can develop resilient infrastructure in the coastal regions, as well as climate smart agriculture system and water security projects as well. But there are certain challenges as well. When there is weak global mitigation, it means that there will be more extreme weather events. We have already seen during the monsoon of 2025 and also the increase of the severity of the cyclones. Alright, at the same time, there would be intensified monsoon disruptions as well. There would be agricultural vulnerability that will increase and that will pose a serious threat to the food security of the nation. And also the land use change and forestry, that is LUCF goals, they would be harder to achieve when it comes to the implications or the challenges that India may face in the near future. Now, what are the UPSC takeaways from the complete COP30 when it comes to the framework or the COP30 that was organized? So over here, the equity and the ambition debates is important. Alright, at the same time, the development and the developed and the developing nations' responsibility is important, and we should focus when you are writing the answer or you are giving the answer, we should focus on the climate justice. Because when it comes to justice, it is that the one who is polluting more, that should pay more. But at the same time, that has not been talked or not been spoken about in the final text of the COP30. At the same time, when it comes to the process, the COP process had strengths and limitations as well when it comes to global governance. So you must, when you are writing the answer or you are speaking, you must speak about both the things. All right. So when it comes to multilateralism, there was challenges as well. There was trust deficit as well. But at the same time, the multilateralism have survived. The diplomacy have survived. So that should also be featured in your answer as well. At the same time, why binding commitments remain elusive despite consensus? So that leads to the governance failures, and that again should be focused in your answers. Alright, so ultimately when we are talking about COP30, it is important for your international relations, environment and climate change, and even for your essay writing and your upcoming personal interview if you have cleared the UPSC 2025. Alright, so that would be all in today's session. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care. Jai Hind. Please do not forget to like, share, as well as subscribe to our channel for more such future updates. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care. Jai Hind. Thank you.